Well, thank you, Scott. It's always a pleasure to be here. I was startled to be reminded to myself that this is the first public presentation I've done in public in 3 years because of you-know-who. And I've done dozens of Zoom presentations in the last 3 years. So public speaking has gone through a transition that's quite interesting, where I can talk to people in Ontario, Quebec, or even, as I did just recently, in the UK by Zoom. But it hasn't got the luster of being in a hall with people, actually seeing people. So welcome back to all of us. Today's presentation draws from the first volume I wrote in the Canadian Battle Series, or it's called Ortona, Canada's Epic World War II Battle. And I've often been asked why the first book in the series focused on this battle. And the answer goes back to, if its genesis goes back to my attending a Remembrance Day ceremony in Kelowna in the early 1990s. After the ceremony, I retired along with a good many World War II vets, because there were lots of World War II vets around in the early 1990s, to the local Legion for the then routine luncheon of soup and stew washed down with beer, as we all did. As a lot of people in Alberta retire to the Okanagan, I found myself sitting at a table with several veterans of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. And they started talking about how much nicer the weather at the ceremony in Kelowna that this November had been with what they experienced in December 1943, fighting in the streets of Ortona. As I was listening to their stories and the jokes about that time that they experienced, I realized that I didn't know anything about the Battle of Ortona. And I thought I was fairly up on World War II military history. So I started looking around and searching for a book on the battle. And it quickly became clear that no such book existed. There were 90 pages on the campaign in Colonel G.W.L. Nicholson's Official Army History on Canadian Operations in Italy from 1943 to 1945. So they provided a thin sketch with few actual accounts by veterans of the battle. I then tracked down Daniel Dancox's popularization of Nicholson's history, and he had added a few more personal stories. But really, it was just a popular history of the official history containing somewhat more readable text. And there was just 32 pages dedicated to Ortona. Everything I read spoke to the ferocity of this battle and the heavy cost and casualties. And I started to thinking to myself, there really needs to be a book solely about Ortona. Now, I've written one military history book, I should correct myself, at that time, which was the Gallant Cause about the Canadians who went to the Spanish Civil War. That was my sole experience of writing military history. That book had not done particularly well, so there wasn't, it wasn't like the publishers were tripping over me saying, Mark, will you do a military history? But I really felt that if somebody was going to write it, it didn't seem like anyone else was going to, so it really was, the buck was in my court. And so I developed a proposal, and I spent a few years finally securing an agent, a literary agent, who then started representing the idea to publishers. And the rejections flowed in at a very steady rate through the mid-1990s. One editor at a publishing house called Stoddart, which some of you might remember, it's now long departed, it went into bankruptcy. And he responded that, I really like the idea, but World War II was a long time ago and nobody really seems to care anymore. And he alluded to the declining numbers that were coming to Remembrance Day ceremonies as yet more evidence that this was all too true. And it really began to look like the idea was going to come to a dead end. And then 1998 comes along, and Saving Private Ryan hits the theaters across Canada and around the world. The film, stunningly, despite all of its dramatic shortcomings, brought World War II into the public spotlight. Within days of that film debuting in Toronto, said editor at Stoddart contacted my agent. Is that book about Ortona still on offer? Hours later, we had a contract, and in 1999, Ortona was published. And it came out just before December, 56 years after the battle was fought. And so I can honestly say that Steven Spielberg is responsible for my then dedicating the majority of my writing career to chronicling the campaigns and battles that Canada's Army fought in World War II. And as an aside, if you think back to the legislature Remembrance Day ceremonies that we have, that November, after Saving Private Ryan came out, the crowd in the whole audience there was hugely bigger. There were several thousand people came, and they brought their kids, and they brought their, and that has, more or less remained the same. It was a break for COVID, but we are still seeing pretty good numbers coming out, and people bringing their children and grandchildren to it. So I think it's interesting to look at how one film can kind of change things dramatically. But let's not dwell on that. Let's turn to 1943 and the operations in Italy. On July 10th, if I can remember how to use a pointer. There we go. On July 10th, 1943, we land right there, Canadians on what's called Bark West. And it's 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Army Tank Brigade, which will soon be renamed as the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade, that land just west of Syracuse, where I pointed, in Sicily, and as part of British 8th Army. The invasion of Sicily was called Operation Husky, and the Canadians who'd sailed from England to join the invasion played a key role in the victory there. Between July 10th and when the Canadians stood down, roughly here, just in front of Mount Etna, at a place called the Drano, on the western flank of Mount Etna, the troops had slogged 210 kilometers in extreme heat and through fierce fighting. At the campaign's end, 562 Canadians had perished, and another 1,748 were casualties. There was little time to regroup, as on September 3rd, they joined the British assault into Reggio Calabria, right here, on the toe of the boot. And a largely Anglo-American force, meanwhile, was advancing up the western coast here, and we were advancing that direction. 8th Army marched up the eastern side, mostly. Some of 8th Army went over onto that western side. Disregarding Italy's formal and unconditional surrender on September 8th, the German forces bitterly opposed these advances. Now, Italy's geography, of course, is that there's this impenetrable spine that runs up here called the Apennine Mountains. So you can't fight in the mountains, so you got to fight on the coastal plains, and they're quite narrow. And so it's a landscape that favors the defender. There's countless rivers spilling off either flank. They're not actually on the map here, very good. But you can imagine out of those Apennines, there's rivers flowing both into the Adriatic and into the Tyrrhenian Sea. And rivers, of course, create major defensive positions. You can set up your defenses behind them, and you have the attacker has to come across them. So the Germans defended all the rivers and ridges as much as they could to give themselves time to harden their first major defensive feature. On the Adriatic coast side, this is codenamed the Bernhardt Line, and it's right there. And it stood behind a river called the Sangro, and the Germans hoped to hold 8th Army at the Sangro. However, on November 28th, 78th British Division and 8th Indian Division won crossings over that river. fierce three-day battle then ensued that also drew in the New Zealand Division and cost 2,800 Allied casualties before the Germans withdrew toward their next defensive line behind the Moro River. The Moro is just up here, and that's where we're looking for Ortona. No, sorry. Sangre River there, Ortona, and the Moro River up in there. Having achieved the breakthrough at the Sangre River, General Montgomery planned what he called a colossal crack that would carry 8th Army up the coast of Pescara, and then he would swing inland along the highway leading directly to Rome. And there's a highway just down into there, down into Rome. And that's what he was hoping to do. My troops have won the battle as they always do, Montgomery declared. The road is open. At the same time, he fretted, I must have fine weather. If it rains continuously, I am done. In the early morning of December 4th, a downpour of rain begins. The Sangro River swells by 2 meters. Pontoon bridges and footbridges are swept away. The ability to move troops and supplies towards the Moro River is largely lost. I don't think we can get any spectacular results so long as it goes on raining. The whole country becomes a sea of mud, and nothing on wheels or tracks can move off the roads, Montgomery grumbled. He abandons any hope of liberating Rome, and he sets his eyes now on Ortona, which lies 9 kilometers north of the Moro River, and another town just beyond Ortona called Pescara. If he can win these coastal communities, which he thinks is an achievable undertaking, and he wins them before winter, forces a halt to major offensive operations, he will then have the opportunity to use Ortona and Pescara as rest areas and also to build up his strength for operations come the spring. As Monty's dream is dashed, he turns leading the advance over to 1st Canadian Infantry Division under command of Major General Chris Vokes, who's pictured here. Now, as a divisional commander, Monty considered Vokes to be, as he put it, a good plain cook rather than a skilled chef. On the same day that the Canadians approached the Moro River, this defensive line is taken over by 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. Now, these are crack troops. They deployed also a tremendous amount of firepower. Each Panzer Grenadier Battalion was armed with 59 light and 12 heavy machine guns. They had 3 75mm anti-tank guns each and 10 medium or heavy mortars. The Grenadiers know that the coming fight is unwinnable, but they plan instead to make the Canadians bleed for every bit of ground. Their standard tactic is to fight from fortified positions. Once forced out of those positions, they immediately launch lightning-quick counterattacks, hoping to throw the enemy back before it can consolidate. One of my colleagues in Liberation Tours has a joke about this. He says, what are 3 things you can count on in life? Death, taxes, and a German counterattack. The Moro River ideally suited this kind of tactic, as it had steep banks. So they dug in on the north ridge overlooking the river, and they waited. This photo was taken actually on the southern ridge overlooking the Moro River Valley, and it shows the condition of the roads in the area at this point of time. With the persistent rain, they've become very muddy and slippery. Now, Monty was in a hurry, so there was no time for reconnaissance. Vokes decides the first task is to win a crossing point where engineers could construct a bridge to get vehicles and, most importantly, tanks across. And he's looking down in here. This is where he wants to get across. Villa Regati is there, San Leonardo, and there. So he's trying to win 3 different places, and whichever one serves is best suited for bridging, they'll go ahead and build their bridge. So over by the coast, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, the Hasty Peas is their nickname, were attacking along the main road that leads to Ortona. In the center, the Seaforth Highlanders are attacking in here towards San Leonardo. And on the left side, Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry go for Villa Rogati. Vaux believes that San Leonardo offers the best potential. So the other two attacks go in first in hopes of drawing Panzer Grenadiers away from that point. Just before midnight on December 5th, the assaults began. The Hasty Peas ran into heavy machine gun fire and were thrown back almost immediately. On the left, the PPCLI managed to win their way into Villa Rogati and take it. But in the center, the Seaforth's assault, when it goes forward, is blocked. The PPCLI's Lieutenant Colonel Cameron Ware believes if he was reinforced, an advance right through to Ortona could quickly ensue. He thought they could just go straight up here and get into Ortona. However, the division's chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Walsh, comes in and studies the river crossing point below the village. And he tells folks construction of a bridge there is impossible. Under protest, Ware is ordered to withdraw, and Vaux begins planning a set-piece battle that's going to be slow and costly. About 2 weeks later, the Indian Division takes over that sector around Villa Rogati, and they throw a bridge across it in a matter of hours, and they put up a sign saying, "The Impossible Bridge." There's more than a little bit of competitiveness out there. At 4 p.m. on December 8th, 350 artillery pieces unleashed the heaviest barrage that had been fired to date by Western Allies. The guns were fired so rapidly that Canadian gunner Bill Strickland saw his 25-pounder's barrel glow translucent red. Blood was flowing down his cheeks from each of his shattered eardrums. Tearing off their coats and shirts, the gunners worked bare-chested, bodies dripping with sweat. Strickland, reeling with exhaustion, passing shells forward maniacally, said, "Everywhere destruction and disintegration." War artist Charles Comfort added to this. Shattered buildings, mutilated trees, nothing, it seemed, could survive that fire. As the barrage lifted, the 48th Highlanders and Royal Canadian Regiment advanced on San Leonardo. The 48th Highlanders were jabbing from the front, and the RCR was hooking in from the right through that bridgehead won by the Hasty Peas. In 90 minutes, the Highlanders reported they had 2 companies digging in outside San Leonardo. Behind them, engineers began confining the river to a culvert built out of barrel drums, over which a timber bridge, pictured here, would be constructed. Driving a D7 bulldozer, Sapper Milton McNaughton spent 7 hours under constant machine gun and artillery fire, carving out an exit ramp on the river's northern bank. His tenacious refusal to abandon the job earned him a military medal. And at 7 a.m., December 9th, the bridge was finished, and the engineers named it Chithouse Crossing. And we have what's that? I have to go back here. I'll go past that. Missing a slide. Dawn saw San Leonardo still in German hands as the Royal Canadian Regiment's hook from the coast to the village had been stopped cold. There was supposed to be a picture of a house. When the regiment withdrew, one platoon commanded by Lieutenant Mitch Sterling was cut off and left behind. Fighting out of a 2-story farmhouse that became known as Sterling's Castle, the platoon held out until nightfall, when it was able to break contact and escape. At dawn, Vaux fed the Seaforth Highlanders and Calgary Tank Regiment across the just-opened bridge. And with the Seaforths riding on the tank hulls, the force ground into San Leonardo. A fierce fight ensued that cost the Seaforths 50 dead And the Calgary tankers had 37 of 51 Shermans knocked out, but just 6 crew die and 10 were wounded. And this image shows 2 of the tanks which actually ran off the road during the December 9th attack being recovered. The Germans slowly gave ground while preparing their next fighting position. Still, the terrain favored them. Most of the open country around Ortona is covered in vineyards and olive groves that looked then, as they still do today. This is a contemporary photo I took. The grapevines are strung along wires connected to this kind of concrete post that you see here. And the olive trees are planted close together as well. Infantry moving through the vineyards had to go forward crouched, very low, because the vines are usually about this high, so you got to be crouched underneath. And the tanks can make very little progress at all. Snapped wires, those metal wires, when they snap, they commonly get entangled in the tracks, and they disable the tanks. Also, if you're a tank commander and you're sitting with your head out of the turret, you're at risk of being beheaded. And the Germans could easily create lines of fire by shooting down these rows. You can see how perfectly that would work as a line of fire, and yet you can't really see who's firing at you. So very good killing grounds. Progress was slow but steady. Vaux's main drive was up the road from San Leonardo to its junction with the road that runs this way across into Ortona. So they fight up this way into here. They're making their way up there towards the lateral codenamed Cider Crossroads, which is roughly there. Nearby on the right stands Vino Ridge, and once 2nd Brigade was astride the lateral road, Vaux expected the Germans to cede Ortona and withdraw northward to a feature called the Arieli River. The Canadians, however, had overlooked a significant tactical feature barring their path, and that's this little thing running along here. You can barely see it, just a little line running along and down to here where it kind of peters out. It would soon be known as the Gully. It's 5 kilometers long, and it ranges in depth from 60 to 90 meters. The Gully's southern bank was a perfect reverse slope into which the Panzer Grenadiers had dug deep fortifications. This is a view from the north side of the Gully, so the Ortona side, looking across to the south side. So the Germans are dug in here they've got reverse slope defenses dug in here. We're attacking from, say, that house towards them. We use artillery. The Germans dig in here, the shells come by, they land harmlessly down into there, and as the Canadian infantry comes forward, they come out of their holes, run up to the crest here, and begin firing from sighted positions into the Canadian attack. It's into this bank that they've dug in heavily. Again, 90th Panzer Grenadiers know about this kind of fighting. They're very, very good at it. And against them, Vaux mounts a series of individual battalion-sized attacks preceded by the artillery and mortar barrages, which we've seen don't do much. And the Germans are then unscathed because they're hiding down below in the reverse slope. And the moment the shells stop falling, they rush up the slope, get into their fighting positions, and they shred one battalion after another, after another, after another. The road running from San Leonardo to Cider Crossroads was named Vancouver by the Seaforth. But the main point to make here is the continuing to deteriorate conditions, the increasing mud, the rain is now almost constant. By December 13th, after 4 days of failed individual infantry attacks, infantry battalion attacks, Vaux finally recognizes his only option is to bypass the gully, where it petered out to the west. So down here, the gully eventually just sort of peters out. It gets lower and lower and lower until it's gone entirely. And at the same time, the 90th Panzer Grenadiers are exhausted by now, and they're badly depleted by casualties. They begin handing off to the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. These paratroops were considered the most skilled and tough formation in Italy. Against these fresh troops, Vaux can muster only one full-strength battalion, the Royal 22E Regiment, the Vendeuse. He orders it and Major Herschel Smith's Ontario Squadron to seize Casa Berardi with a two-company advance at 7 a.m. on December 14th. Reaching the start line 15 minutes late, and this is a painting by Charles Comfort of the Battle of Casa Berardi, the two companies were met by intense machine gun fire the moment they set across the start line. The right-hand company strayed offline and actually wandered off into the West Nova Scotia's perimeter. But Captain Paul Triquet of C Company, with the Ontario tanks alongside, keeps going. The advance Triquet called later one long cavalry, in which every foot forward was won in blood. At 8:30 a.m., Casa Berardi was 2,000 meters away. The rapidly dwindling force of Vendeuse kept pushing through, as Triquet described it, a wasteland of trees with split limbs, burnt-out vehicles, dead animals, and cracked shells of houses. Every tree and house was defended. The fresh paratroopers were determined to stop the Vendeuse. Captain Bob Donald, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, was alongside Triquet, and he was summoning in artillery fire that constructed an explosive wall on either flank of the infantry. With just 200 meters to go, a severe German barrage hit them. The Vendeuse, left in this company, numbered just 21 men. Only 5 tanks remained, and one of these was soon lost. "The safest place for us is the objective," Triquet yelled. At 2:30 p.m., Casa Berardi was taken, and just 14 Vendeuse still stand. At dusk, Donald is killed by a shell. The situation seems hopeless. Then at midnight, D Company slipped through, and soon the whole Vendeuse battalion has arrived, and the gully was turned, and an absolutely epic fight was won. Captain Paul Triquet became the first Canadian in the Italian campaign to be awarded a Victoria Cross. The government brought him home to promote French-Canadian involvement in the war. In Montreal, 300,000 people turned out to watch Triquet being driven by in a car. He then toured the country for the 6th Victory Loan campaign, but he was deeply uncomfortable with this public relations role. He desired only to return to the Vendeuse. Post-war, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He struggled with alcoholism because of being haunted by what he called the noise of the mind. He was forcibly retired in 1947, but he overcame his demons in the 1950s. He joined the reserves, and he retired as a brigadier in 1960, and he would die in 1980. Unless the seizure of Casa Berardi could be exploited with an advance behind the gully along the Ortona lateral, the feature still blocked 1st Division's route into Ortona. And so this is Casa Berardi. We still have to drive through here, and you can see the Germans are very intent on stopping that. As Vaux had only 2 of 9 battalions unengaged, the 48th Highlanders far to the left guarding the divisional flank, and the badly battered RCRs, he decided to back the Vendeuse with another Ontario squadron to advance along the road towards Ortona, while the Carleton and York Regiment would assault the gully frontally. Realizing this effort was likely to fail, so one might wonder why bother launching it, he then warned the 48th and RCR battalions to be prepared to pass through the Vendoux. Now this sketch shows the Vendoux and the Carleton, New York operations there, and the difficulties they run into. Hearing of the planned attack, RCR Strong Galloway, pictured here in Sicily, wrote, "A frontal attack across these vine-clad gullies just won't work. A new plan is needed." This was proven at 7:30 a.m. on December 5th, when the Carletons were halted just 200 meters from their start line, with 12 dead and 27 wounded. To get to Cider Crossroads from Casa Berardi was obviously going to require a lot of artillery and a lot of tank support. Vokes spent 2 days teeing that up, and then on December 18th, another attack went forward. Casualties among the 48th Highlanders and RCR were terrible. The RCR ended the day with just 19 officers and 159 men still standing. Among the dead was Lieutenant Mitch Sterling of Sterling's Castle. He and his entire platoon were cut down by machine gun fire, their bodies found lying in an arrowhead formation. But the 48th Highlanders managed to get through, encountering less resistance than expected on their front. And this was because the German paratroopers are actually beginning to withdraw into Ortona. On December 19th, Cider Crossroads, now home to a Canadian tank sitting in the middle of it, was taken. One observer described it as one complete mass of smoking shells and blasted scenes. Before the war came to Ortona, it was a town that was very pleasant. It was known as the Pearl of the Adriatic. It enjoyed some popularity as a seaside resort to which middle-level Roman bureaucrats came with their families to escape the city's torturous heat. They came by train, and down here is the train station. They disembarked from their trains there, and they boarded a gondola that carried them up that steep slope to the esplanade from which this photo was taken circa 1940. The port was primarily used by fishermen and few small freighters that took advantage of the rail connection that runs to Rome. One curiosity of note was that in September 1939, when the Italian king fled Rome to Ortona after the surrender, it was Ortona that he escaped from by boarding an Allied destroyer just before Italy formally surrendered. Ortona's permanent population in 1943 was about 10,000 people. Founded in the medieval age, the town's buildings were old. The streets, save Corso Vittorio Emanuele, pictured here, which ran north to south through its center, were little more than ox carts in width, and throughout most of the buildings were 2 to 3 story structures with connecting walls running long distances. You can see how the walls are all connected, and the structures are, 2 to 3. Now, what's happened with my slides? It's very weird. German engineers from the Parachute Division had begun transforming the town into a defensive position on December 12th, with the effort intensifying as the battle reached the gully. There was a clock in the municipal hall at the bottom of the Corso Emanuele that most Italian towns in the municipality, they have a big clock in a tower, and it predates watches, so it was how people knew what the time was. The Germans removed the clock and stuck 2 machine guns in there that could fire along the length of the Corso Emanuele. On December 19th, 2 large buildings were also demolished to create a rubble pile taller than a man and wider than 2 trucks parked side by side. Smaller rubble piles were created throughout the town to clog all the side streets. Now, mines were sown everywhere. Booby traps hooked to toilet plungers and inviting wine bottles were left in untouched houses with cords running into explosives. Gun positions were established in basements by cutting holes in the walls at street level. A half-hearted effort was made to evacuate civilians, but many stayed, hunkering in cellars. Most, however, sought shelter in the 2 railway tunnels that run under the town to reach the station by the port. And it's an interesting, if we look at Gaza, we're now looking at this network of tunnels that exists. The Canadians didn't know about those tunnels running under the town. And the Germans were using them as a way to move around in the town, pop up wherever they kind of wanted to. We didn't know they were there until after the battle was actually over. So the tunnels are serving the Germans well and able to move around, but they've got their kitchens, their supply depots, their first aid posts, their rest areas, all are down underground there. On December 19th, the engineers dynamite an elegant tower that stands adjacent to the Cattedrale San Tommaso, which is pictured here. That tower, as it falls, slices the cathedral's grand dome precisely in half to create another massive rubble pile in a square near the Municipal Halls Square. In recent years, there's been attempts by various pro-German Italian historians, of which there's a remarkable number out there, to blame the destruction of the cathedral on the Canadians, particularly 2nd Brigade's Brigadier Bert Hofmeister of Vancouver, Seaforth. And they say that it was actually destroyed by Canadian artillery to prevent the church being used by the Germans. Sheer nonsense. An engineer, German engineer named Karl Bayerlund, described the destruction of the tower and slicing a part of the dome in his diary that he provided to me during the research of Ortona. He was a Fallschirmjäger engineer. The Germans also breached the mole that protected the port and sunk various vessels in an attempt to render the port unusable when they had to surrender the town. On December 20th, 2nd Brigade moved towards Ortona. Loyal Edmonton Regiment approached via a road running behind the gully. The Seaforth Highlanders came in via the coastal access, as shown here. Vokes and his intelligence staff were not expecting a real fight. They figured all the Seaforths and the Eddies would have to do is start probing into the outskirts, and the paratroops would withdraw to the Ariali River, north of Ortona, and establish a new defensive line. Instead, they walked into the middle of a deadly killing ground and became entangled in a fierce battle. This photo shows a typical side street clogged with rubble. As the Canadians realized the paratroopers are going to fight with all they have, Vokes responds by unleashing artillery on call by the fighting companies. Building after building is destroyed by shell fire that both the Canadians and Germans are throwing at each other. Veterans of the battle told me repeatedly of how the noise of explosions and collapsing buildings was just a constant background, day and night, along with the ripping sounds of the German MG-42 machine guns and the slower thudding of the Canadian Bren guns. The South Saskatchewan Light Infantry set up its 4.2-inch mortars on the outskirts, and they added their fire to the mix. Brigadier Hofmeister, commanding 2nd Brigade, divides the town into two. The Loyal Eddies will attack up here on the eastern flank, and the Seaforth Highlanders go into the rabbit's maze warren of housing in here to fight their way through. The Eddies concentrate on the Corso Emmanuel, which is that wide street we talked about earlier. That's the two battle zones. Now, it's also often been argued by Canadian historians that instead of fighting for Ortona, it should have been bypassed to the east. This seems an attractive argument, except for when you look at this, there's actually an escarpment here, and it's several hundred feet high, upon which Ortona then stands up here. So the Germans up here can bring fire on anybody trying to move to the west of the town. I said east, it should have been to the west. This seems, so that argument doesn't hold. Attempts by 1st Brigade to actually advance through that ground were brought to a dramatic halt by fire coming out of Ortona and other nearby high ground overlooking the flank. This photo shows the entrance to the Corso Emanuele from a large square. In addition to the 2 infantry battalions, the tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment were thrown into the fray. You can see one of their tanks firing from here. The tanks generally worked as a mobile artillery platform in this battle. They can't do a lot else. And one thing to keep in mind is the Germans at this point do not have a shoulder-launched anti-tank weapon, which is the Panzerfaust. They've developed it in December 1943, but they've only deployed it into the Russian front. Had the Germans had the Panzerfausts, Ortona's battle could have gone much more negatively towards the Canadians because our tanks were relatively impervious except to the few anti-tank guns that the paratroopers had. Which doesn't mean they didn't knock out our tanks, but they couldn't knock them out the way they would have had they had Panzerfausts. The street fight inside Ortona quickly devolves into one where brigadiers and battalion commanders and divisional commanders are asserting little or no control. Men are fighting in sections and platoons. Even company commanders find themselves unable to effectively communicate with those platoons. Now, the Corso has another feature to it that increased the hazard for the Canadians. From the square we were just looking at, where the tank was, the street gradually descends to the municipal hall, which is not visible in the distance there. And remember, there was those machine guns in the clock tower. This meant that the Canadians, in this case the Eddies, as they're walking down the street, they're silhouetted. And at the same time, they're unable to see the Germans that are firing from positions in the cellars or from behind the rubble piles. Movement on the streets throughout Ortona very quickly becomes increasingly impossible. Then Captain Wilmot George Bill Longhurst of the Eddies, A Company, devised a solution. If the men can't advance in the streets, they go forward inside the buildings, hemming them in. It was a tactic called mouse holing. Remember, the buildings are all adjoining each other, so you can blow holes through one building into another, into another, into another. He and 2 battalion pioneers molded plastic explosives into a demolition charge shaped like a beehive. Set against the adjoining wall, the explosive rips open a hole through which the Eddies then can rush with their guns blazing, particularly the Thompson submachine gun over there. And so they call the process mouse holing, and soon the Seaforths and Eddies are both blasting paths through the interconnecting buildings and thus avoiding the deadly streets. Now, unknown to the Canadians in Ortona, Longhurst hadn't actually developed a new fighting technique. Mouse holing was part of the British Army's doctrine for street fighting in what they were called fighting in built-up areas. But the Canadians never received that training, so they made up the tactic on the spot. And Longhurst, by the way, will be killed on October 21st, 1944, still at the head of A Company, during an attack crossing of the Savio River up by Ravenna. Inside Ortona on December 24th, the Seaforths become locked in a violent battle for control of a square they called Dead Horse Square because of the dead horse lying there. The church in the background was Chiesa San Francesco, and in the middle of the fight, Seaforth Major June Thomas ran over to a tank commanded by Corporal Gord Turnbull. He pointed to the tower where a German machine gunner was firing down on the square, and he said, "As much as I hate blasting the tower of that church, I want you to get him out of there." Turnbull replied, "It's Christmas Eve and that's God's house." Thomas is unmoved. Knowing it was the right call, Turnbull blasts the tower apart with high explosive rounds. Christmas Day came and the battle raged on. While the Eddies were given no more than some cold pork chops and a bottle of beer out where they were fighting, the Seaforths enjoyed a Christmas dinner that would become a Canadian military legend. On the southern outskirts of Ortona, It's the Church Santa Maria de Constantinople, where the Seaforths were using the building as a headquarters. On Christmas Day, each Seaforth company was withdrawn one by one from the front line and served a fairly full Christmas dinner with roast pork instead of turkey, but all the other trimmings, and a couple of beers per man. For a long time, it was thought this photo was taken somewhere else, but in recent years, several soldiers of the Seaforths have been identified as sitting at that table, and one veteran, actually two now, were even able to point themselves out in the photo. The confusion came from the fact that the photo isn't actually inside the church. It's at a small courtyard adjacent to the church, and that courtyard no longer exists. So it led to some confusion. Some Seaforths were fed dinner inside the church, and many more gathered inside to be led by Padre Roy Durnford, pictured there, singing Christmas carols. At a set time, the company then marched back into battle, and another company was withdrawn. In this way, most of the Seaforths and quite a number of Three Rivers Regiment tankers enjoyed a Christmas dinner that was unique, welcome, and surreal in the setting of Ortona's battleground. And the Seaforth Highlanders still hold every year an Ortona Christmas dinner. December 26th saw the fighting rising to an even more feverish pitch. Vehicles and tanks burned throughout the town. Most of Ortona had been reduced by now to a ruin. Ground was gained, but the paratroopers refused to quit. Media in the Western Allied nations were spellbound by the story of the battle. The New York Times dubbed it Little Stalingrad. Vokes called a meeting with Brigadier Hoffmeister. This is Vokes there, Hoffmeister, and Brigadier Wyman of the tanks. Called a meeting with Hoffmeister in the center. Vokes said he would withdraw 2nd Brigade and send in another brigade if Hoffmeister felt the casualties were becoming insurmountable. Hoffmeister replied that he felt the battle was almost won, and to quit now would devastate the morale of the Seaforth and Eddies. Hoffmeister was right. Inside Ortona, the paratroops were running out of ground and out of men. Also, over on that far left, we're starting to make some progress. We'll have a pause. No, we don't need to pause. Okay, we will carry on. And they're gaining ground. There was the 48th Highlanders advancing onto some high ground that looked across the valley on the east flank of Ortona. From here, the Highlanders could see Ortona, and artillery moved to that position, could fire on the north flank of the town to threaten the escape route for the paratroopers. On the night of December 27th, the paratroopers melted away, and at dawn, a patrol of Loyal Eddies went forward and met no opposition. It was led by Lieutenant Alan Johnson, who retired to Victoria and lived out most of his life here. And the battle was won. As Johnson came into the area where the paratroopers were, an Italian walked up to him and said, "What took you so long?" The highest overall determinations report the 1st Division having 695 killed, with wounded, sick, and missing, added up to 3,511 casualties altogether, 695 of those being killed. Battle exhaustion took an amazing toll, 587 cases reported in 3 weeks of December. German losses are impossible to pin down. 1st Parachute Division reported that between December 20th and 28th, it suffered 455 casualties. Yet the Canadians collected more than 100 dead from inside Ortona alone for mass burial. So this figure seems quite low, considering the fighting across the breadth of the front. As for 90th Panzer Grenadier Division, it's believed that by the time it was withdrawn, no single battalion numbered more than 100, and 361st Regiment's 3rd Battalion was confirmed to have been reduced from a full strength of 300 to just 12 men. More than 400 Panzer Grenadiers were taken prisoner, and most Canadian battalion estimates of casualties inflicted indicate that the divisions had lost hundreds, either killed or wounded. Civilian losses also vary and are elusive, but the reality is that most civilians had not been able to evacuate Ortona before the fighting began. So we had 10,000 people in the village, roughly. Say 1,000 of them may have been able to evacuate, but unlikely. And the number that have been killed, and the Italians have been able to tally them directly to a name, are 1,314. So over a tenth of the population of Ortona is dead at the end of this battle, which gives you also a good indication of what's going on in Gaza. Amid the ruins, the people of Ortona begin to rebuild. It was a process that's going to continue for more than a decade. Still today, there are ruined buildings to be found on side streets. About half the town, that on the waterfront side of the Corso, was rebuilt exactly as it had been before the battle. The eastern side, the western side, I should say, I'll make them turn around. The western side underwent extensive modernization. Remarkably, the people of Ortona continue today to be grateful to the Canadians for liberating them. Every Remembrance Day, they gather at the Moral River Canadian Cemetery for a ceremony of remembrance. And this monument, called the Price of Peace, is situated in a prominent square next to the Municipal Hall. And during COVID, when there wasn't a lot for people to do, the municipality also took this square and created a massive maple leaf in the center of the square. So it's now called Maple Leaf Square. And on the outskirts of Ortona, the Moral River Canadian Cemetery is the final resting ground for all those soldiers who perished in this epic battle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a fascinating account. Two quick questions, if I may. The Panzer Grenadiers, the 90th, do you know anything about their background? You suggested at the outset that these were deeply experienced. Were they veterans of the war?
Yes.
Russia?
North Africa, particularly. They were the 90th Light Infantry Division, as they were known in North Africa. And so they were considered the most elite member of the Africa Corps. So they lost a lot of guys, of course, at the end of the African campaign. And they then moved to Sardinia to regroup. And a lot of Russian front veterans were then fed into that division. So it became two sides of the coin kind of division, but very, very competent, very good fighters. I would say I'm close to a par with the Fallschirmjäger Division. The first Fallschirmjäger Division were extremely good. And, of course, we Canadians would end up fighting them 6 times in Italy. Every time we were in a major campaign, guess who shows up? and that was kind of the way it was going. Because very quickly, by the Leary Valley campaign, the Canadians have been, 1st Canadian Corps is identified by the 8th Army as the shock troops of 8th Army. And the Germans know this as well. So whenever we're moving, the Fallschirmjäger Division is moving to meet us. And that's kind of what happened. Anyway, you said you had 2 questions.
Yes, I wanted you to comment on perhaps the biggest archival challenges that you've encountered in terms of working on your book. What were some of the problems?
The biggest problem at that time, because I was new to this, I think the biggest problem with the archival research at that time was me. It took me a long time to figure out how to do it effectively. Also, in those days, we weren't allowed to do photography in the Ottawa archives. You had to flag everything for photocopying, and they were charging 25 cents a sheet. So I spent probably $2,500 just getting photocopying at the archives. So you're selective about what you're copying. And I'm sure I missed stuff as a result. Nowadays, and for the last 6-7 books, we're allowed to do photography. And so you go in and you get the documents, and I don't bother reading the documents when I'm in Ottawa. I just photograph everything. I call it the crash and grab strategy of research. John.
Thanks, Mark. No reference. What was it like in Italy in terms of following up a coastal town? What was the Navy, or the Allied Navy's doing in the Adriatic? There's no reference to shelling from ships. And what about aircraft? What was happening to the
So in December, the weather was incredibly bad, and the air support was negligible because they couldn't fly. The Navy was present with a couple battle cruisers when that big artillery shoot was done. They were shooting as well from offshore. But thereafter, the battlefield becomes so constricted that they can't really bring accurate naval fire in, partly because they still don't actually know how to do that. By the time of D-Day and the fighting in Normandy, we see the naval, particularly the monitors, providing very close and accurate fire because we have forward observation officers who actually are able to talk to the naval ships. But in Ortona, they didn't have that capability yet. It's the same as the Air Force had not yet developed what will be called cab rank, where they would actually be able to just circle above a battlefield, and down below we would have forward observation officers who could communicate with them by wireless and call them down as needed. That's not developed until 1944 again in Normandy, for Normandy. So there's these tactics that just haven't come into existence yet. Yes.
I have an anecdote I'd like to share with everybody. Herschel Smith's name came up, and he actually retired and lived in Victoria. Maybe some of you have met him. He's deceased now. He was an associate member of the Canadian Scottish Mess. And in 1990, I was in the mess with a visiting armored veteran from Calgary. I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden this chap jumps up and says, "That's Herschel." And Herschel had been his town commander, and the last time he'd seen Herschel was being removed from a Sherman tank, and he was sure that his SEAL never survived. I found that interesting, that you would have thought Word would have come back. Anyway, Herschel did survive. He lost a leg. We don't know that from Herschel, because he rode his bike all over town. He was very active in the Salvation Army, etc. But it was an amazing experience for this veteran to look across and that was my CO, and the last time I saw him was in the Normandy campaign, being removed from the tanks that I was certain that he was going to die. Anyway.
Yes.
Mark, I'm not sure about the chaplaincy, because of course with all the casualties, they must have been very busy. And in my research about the Franciscan friars who served, there was a Father Alphonse Claude Lamarche, and he was in he was at Ortona, a Canadian chaplain with the 22nd Regiment of Anjou.
Yes.
And he was wounded by shrapnel in the Battle of Ortona, and I wondered if you came across his name.
I didn't. That's interesting. I didn't. As we know, quite a number of Padres, were killed in the war because they were usually handling the stretcher bearer parties. They were in charge of overseeing the removal of wounded and then also going out into the battlefield to recover the dead. One, I can't remember his name now, one chaplain in Normandy who was killed when his Jeep that they were using to pick up bodies ran over a mine. So, yeah, it was tough duty for the Padres, for sure. Yes?
Are you aware of organized tours to any of the sites that you've written about?
Thank you for playing into that. As it happens, yes, I work with a company called Liberation Tours, and we do a annual Italian campaign tour. We do a Northwest Europe tour that's World War I and World War II. This fall, we did one called the Cinderella Army Tour, which followed 1st Canadian Army from England to Normandy and then all the way up to Northern Holland. So yes, and I happen to have a series of business cards for you to take away. Anyway, yes, I like to think we're the best of the battlefield tour
I want to
companies.
mention that our new member, Rob Forbes, was on March tour last October, was it?
Yes, I think so.
In
Yeah.
Italy, so he gets the experience.
highly recommend.
Totally good. Okay. Looks, yeah.
I lost one of my aunts just outside Ortona. She stepped on a body.
What was his relative?
Well, the area is called Abruzzo,
Oh, yes.
and my family, where it says, 3 brothers came, one to Canada, 2 to the United States, and the brother in Detroit moved back to Italy in the 1930s, and he lost his wife stepping on a line.
Right.
Apparently, it was relatively common.
Yes. Well, I think, yeah, and in fact, this last Italian campaign tour that we just did, and I'm just back from, we had a woman whose family had a farm in the Anzio area. And yeah, she said that her father and his brothers, before they could start farming again, which they needed to do because there was no other source of food, they had to clear the mines. And so they were actually, these are like teenage kids, going out and defusing German and Allied mines that were all over their farm. They did that, she said, until one of the neighbors blew himself up on a mine, and then they decided they should let the officials come and do it.
So, Mark, as a fishing port, though, was the harbor big enough to make a difference in terms of logistic movement?
Not really, because it was also quite badly damaged by the Germans, so by the time that damage was sorted out, Rome had already fallen, and Naples becomes the main port.
You know, this is kind of going back to the tour idea, but do you know anything about some kind of like a joint get-together at Christmas one year of German veterans and Allied veterans?
Yes, so that happened in Ortona.
Yeah.
It was a return. It was organized in, I think, maybe 2003. I think it may have been. Yeah, and it was a fairly big deal. A lot of veterans from the Canadian forces, particularly the Loyal Eddies and the Seaforths, went back, and then the first Fallschirmjäger people came down from Germany. And I remember Johnny Dugan, who was a lieutenant. He was a lieutenant at that time in Ortona. He then went on to be a major. I had lunch with him once just before that happened, and he said, well, I'm not really ready to go and sup with the Germans. So he didn't go, but quite a lot did. And they did find it. There's a documentary that was made about it because David Halton, his dad, Matthew Halton, was the CBC reporter during that time, and David Halton and CBC went and did a documentary on that.
Mark, did you get a chance to speak with Hoffmeister? Because he retired in Vancouver, and my wife served on the board with him, saved the children from him.
Yes.
President on the board. Did you get to speak with him?
Yes, I did. His health wasn't that great at the time, and so his caretaker, who was a bit of a Hitler, she said, you have 20 minutes. And at 20 minutes, it was, you 20 minutes is up. So, but I did get an interview with him, and he also had given a fairly extensive interview to Brereton Grenhouse and another, I can't remember the name of the other, who were with Directorate of Heritage and History at D&D, and he gave them quite an extensive interview. So there is a record there.
Was it Alec Douglas?
That might have been, yes. I think that was.
Director of...
Yeah. And so there is a book on Hofmeister called, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's by Doug Delaney of RMC, who's done a history of, a biography about him, and it's reasonably good.
Mark? Just another thing on Hofmeister. He ended up being the division commander of the 5th Division, which was known as the Marine Machine, because the division patch was maroon. But he was also selected to be the commander of the 6th Division, which was destined to go to the Pacific, or Sportsman, that was more important.
Yes, and he always said that the best thing that ever happened was the atomic bomb. Because he was very afraid of what was going to happen if the Canadians had been part of an actual invasion of Japan.
Mark, I was just wondering, in your research, did you come across any evidence that the Canadian Army learned lessons from this battle that were applied to D-Day? Because I know I lived in Vernon for a while, and actually they established the first urban warfare training area in what was a cattle ranch there, and there's still remnants of the buildings there, where they trained platoon-level commanders, etc., and company commanders prior to D-Day in urban warfare.
Yes. Well, there in the aftermath, because we actually spend the winter in Ortona, and you'll see a lot of footage on TV that is purported to be the fighting in Ortona. It's actually our guys doing training in urban warfare. So yes, they brought a lot of the divisions that were a lot of the units that were in Italy in and did intensive training in that. And I'm sure that training then would have migrated out to the, well, in fact, Herschel Smith, one of the reasons he ends up in Normandy is there was a decision to cherry pick a lot of Canadians who had fought in Italy up to about April 1944 that are then brought to Normandy or to the UK and put into units that are going into Normandy, particularly the ones that, not the 3rd Infantry Division that landed at Juno, but the ones that followed on. And it was to basically stiffen those units with some very experienced people, and Herschel Smith was one of those selected for that job.
What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on a commission for the Royal Canadian Artillery Association that is doing a project, some of you recognized it when we were talking about it earlier, called With a Few Guns. It's a 2-volume book on the role that artillery personnel played in the Afghanistan War. And the first volume, which I was not involved in because I was brought in to help when one of the lead authors became too ill to carry on. So the first volume should be released this December. And then there's probably going to be a 2-year pause while we work on the second volume, which will be, so the first volume will go up to 2006, and the second volume will be 2007 to 2014, when we are rolling in the, and with the majority of it being focused on up to 2011, when we cease to be doing combat in Afghanistan. So that's what I'm working on now. And eventually, if I ever get through that, it was supposed to be a much shorter project that it's turned into. I will go back to the Canadian Battle Series and do a volume on the role that Canada played in the war with Japan.
Thank you very much, Mark.